I worked nights at Hemsley Court, a Victorian boarding school in the Cotswolds that smells like polish, chalk, and the kind of cold you can't warm with radiators. The place has 4 houses and too many corridors, all of them narrow enough that the fire doors sigh when you pass. I signed on for the quiet, walk the rounds, check the locks, sign the logs, remind drunk sixth formers they're not invincible. 3 months in, the quiet is what unnerves me most. The building doesn't sleep, it listens. Locker 25 lives in East Wing, lower ground. A run of battered metal doors used by the grounds staff, back when the school kept a small army of men with mops and keystones. The lockers are a leftover, unused, unloved, a row of dented mouths with flaky numbers. The wing is service passages and storage rooms, spare chairs, chemistry stools, old tennis nets rolled like carcasses. A room full of hymnals marked with 1974. There's a smell there that isn't quite damp, isn't quite dust, something older, as if wood remembers when it was a tree and resents the memory. On my first week, I was told the East Wing is for daytime. The bursar prefers a human presence by day and a locked door by night. Fair enough, but the camera feeds don't care about preference. One lens watches the East Wing corridor from above the fire door, angled down the row of lockers towards a red exit sign that bleeds into the lens in the dark. The camera names are plain: North Quad, Dining Hall, Chapel Nave, East Wing, LWR. On an empty night, you find your eyes pushing back to that last one, as if the corridor can feel you looking. I didn't notice locker 25 until the second week. The routine is always the same. Clock in at 21:45, take keys, radio check, sweep the 4 main blocks in a figure of 8, note any doors propped with coins, student's trick, then retire to the control room for the midnight watch. It's a square room with a shiver of monitors and a kettle that never quite boils. The walls are old stone-painted school cream, the color of weak custard. You can hear the building here. The pipes murmur. The electrical board ticks. The whole place hums at a frequency you catch in your teeth. East Wing LWR was black except for the exit glow, a slit of emergency light from a stairwell, and the paler rectangle where the camera sees its own infrared. At 01:58, something changed the contrast down the line. A shape edged in. Nothing dramatic, no figure strolling into frame. Just a difference. The way you notice a door you're sure was shut is now ajar by a hair. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the monitor. Locker 25 had a line of light along its lip, an impossible little crescent. The latches sprung by a padlock, or used to be. The padlock, when I went down to look later, hung like a tongue, looped through the staple, but not through the hasp. It could slide, it shouldn't. The hasp is bent just wrong, like someone worried it for years. I watched and watched that hairline of light. The camera is a cheap one. It eats shadow and washes whites. But the line widened. Something in the frame exhaled. The door didn't swing. It gave. It eased forward the way a bad tooth tilts under pressure, uncentered and sickening. At 2:13 exactly, the time stamped in the corner like a judge, the door kissed the air and stopped. Not open, not closed. Waiting, I told myself a draft could do it. Then pictured the fire doors on either side of that corridor, both of which shut like they're tired of argument. I told myself metal breathes. Then I remembered it shouldn't at that hour, with the heating off and the stone settled. The camera hissed. The audio channel is never on for the corridors. But that night there was a sound in the speakers, a little dry rush like pages turning too quickly to read. When I lifted my head, the kettle was trembling against against its cradle. I don't scare easy, but there's a particular feeling that lives in the body and not the mind. Wolf at the edge of the trees feeling that bypasses thought and goes straight to the hands. Mine were damp. I went down. You learn the building as a series of temperatures. The stairwell down to East Wing is cooler by 3 degrees, and the lights there take their time, clicking alive 1 tube at a time, each with a different shade of white. The air smelled the way old libraries do, when you pull a book no one has touched since before you were born. My footsteps made a dull, soft-heeled sound. I could see my breath in brief, shallow ghosts. At the end of the corridor, the exit sign bleeds red. It's meant to be comforting. It felt like someone had drawn a mouth and told me it was a door. The lockers ran left to right at knee height and chest height, a double row numbered from 1 to 30 in enamel ovals, many of them cracked, some printed wrong so the numbers leaned. 25 sat in the middle of the line like a bad idea. Its paint was bubbled, scratched, a flower of rust blooming near the hinge. The padlock was there, as I'd seen on the feed, on the staple, not the hasp. The hasp was bent like a broken knuckle. I touched the padlock. It was warmer than the metal around it. A simple thing can rattle a person in the night. A warm lock on a cold door. A hinge that sighs like a person you haven't seen in years. A smell that doesn't belong. I tested the door, and it moved. Not much. Just hello. The gap along its lip widened enough to show an interior dark that felt different from the corridor dark, more saturated, as if it held its own night. Control to East Wing. Lawson's voice crackled through my lapel radio. He's my counterpart until 𝗦𝗬𝗏, a man with a voice like gravel and opinions about football. You've got movement on camera. You down there? Affirm, I said. I hate how official I sound on the radio, as if language could make a corridor behave. I'm at the lockers, 25. He hesitated. Don't dawdle. It was the most I've ever heard him say without a complaint attached. I peered into the thinness. I don't know what I expected. A scent, faint, unplaceable, lifted out. Something powdery and sweet, like violets compressed in old paper, or the baker's window early morning when the buns are sugared. A smell at odds with rust. I slid the padlock free without meaning to. My hand did it of its own accord, as if rehearsed. The weight of it surprised me, solid and a little warm, like I was holding an animal that wanted to sleep. The hasp came away with the slow reluctance of something remembering a shape it wasn't meant to make. The hinge whispered. Inside, darkness. Then a small line of white near the back, the edge of an envelope. I told myself it would be mice nest. I told myself it would be nothing at all. I reached in and my sleeve brushed something like very old cloth, thin as breath. I pinched the envelope between 2 fingers and brought it out. It had no stamp and no address, only an initial written in black ink that had feathered L. The paper felt wrong, too soft, like skin that's been in water. When I tilted it, glitter caught in the lick of light from the exit sign. A dusting. My throat felt tight. I'm not a superstitious man, but there are moments when the body knows before the mind allows. I didn't open it. I did the sensible thing. Slid the envelope back, rehooked the hasp by force, and levered the padlock through the right way. It took more pressure than it should have, like the metal was sulking. The padlock clicked. The sound echoed too well in the corridor, traveling further than it should, as if the stone was practicing. When I looked up at the camera eye, A blink of red told me it was watching. I raised a hand to it, a childish gesture, then backed away and keyed the fire door shut. My breath sounded loud. On the way up, the stair lights went out behind me one at a time. I've told myself 100 times it's the sensor resetting to conserve power. In the moment, it felt like being counted. Back in control, the monitor showed East Wing the way you want to see it. Still and indifferent, a mouth stitched shut. I wrote down the time, the door, the padlock discrepancy. I did not write the envelope with the letter. I made tea. My hands jittered the tea bag string and it slapped the cup with a small brown wave. I told myself not to be 16 about it. When the kettle's steam hit the fluorescent light, it thinned into a veil that made the room's edges waver. At 0241, the East Wing audio channel, still officially off, picked up a noise like coins moving in a cloth bag. I tapped the slider even though I know it's dead. The sound stopped immediately, as if it had been waiting for me to notice and run out of patience. The monitor rolled, a slow crawl at the bottom, a glitch that writes its own language. The exit sign flickered and returned. The locker door line stayed shut. For the first 5 minutes after an incident, the building puts every noise in a frame. The water hammer in the West Hall pipes becomes footsteps. The wind through the arrow slit in the chapel becomes breath. A clock tick in the bursar's corridor becomes a fingernail. I sat with it, forced my breathing even, thumbed through the incident log like a parish priest flipping a hymnal. Nothing in the last 6 months about East Wing. A note 2 years ago about vagrants near the old stables. A complaint lodged by a music teacher. Organ keys sticking in the chapel loft. Nothing about lockers. Nothing about envelopes. I should have left it there. But places like Hemsley familiarize you to your own stubbornness. If you don't answer the building's questions, it invents worse ones. At 03:05, I took the torch again. The second time down, the lights felt slower. There's no logic to that, but there you are. The smell in the stairwell had shifted toward cold metal and polish, as if someone had recently wiped the banister with vinegar water. The fire door handle was colder than my breath. When I pushed through, I stopped. The corridor length was wrong. Hemsley, S East Wing lower ground, is 8 paces from the fire door to the lockers, and another 10 to the exit sign. I'd measured it 12 times with my body without meaning to. That's what rounds do. That night it was 12 to the lockers, then 12 again, to the exit, and the red light at the end seemed to sit a little higher. Perspective tricks, I told myself. Fatigue. Except the tiles, those tiny Victorian squares, are honest. 8 paces is 48 small squares. Now I counted 60. The pattern repeated with an ugly little seam, as if someone had copied and pasted a row from a photograph, and hadn't lined it up perfectly. One tile near locker 23 had a tiny bubble in its glaze. That bubble appeared again, 5 tiles over where it never used to be. I stood there like an idiot, counting with my eyes. The torch beam shook over a scatter of dust motes that looked like snow caught in headlights. When I swung the light along the lockers, the numbers looked a fraction skewed. It takes nerve to test something your brain is arguing about. I put my palm flat against 25. The metal held a temperature like a person who has just stood up from a chair. My radio popped, control to East Wing. It was Lawson again. He shouldn't have been there. He clocks off at 02:00. The clock on my wrist said 03:06. Go ahead, I said. The torch beam quivered over a spider web and made it glitter like frost. Thought you ought to know, Lawson said. His tone was casual, in the way of men who have never mastered casual. Got a ping on entry 3. Gatehouse picked movement. Dog, maybe. A beat. You near East Wing? I looked at the door until it looked back. Yes. Right. Don't dawdle. He wasn't in the building. There was no reason for his voice to ride the radio then. The exact tonal weight, the slight drawl he gets when he's bored. The hairs on my neck went static. My thumb pressed the transmit button, but I let go without speaking. The padlock hanging on 25 clicked against the metal, as if shifted by an unseen hand, just a small tap announcing itself. I lowered the torch in a slow arc. A line of shining powder traced along the base of the lockers, fine as ground glass. It wasn't there before, or I'd have stepped in it. It tracked from locker 25 to 27, then vanished under 28 like a trail of something poured, not spilled. When I squatted, the smell rose to meet me. Sweet, powdery, the kind of scent you get when you crack open a music box that hasn't deplayed in years, and the felt inside sighs. I touched the powder with the back of my knuckle. It stuck in a half moon and shone under the torch. My skin felt cooler where it touched, as if that patch of me had been edited. I don't open other people's mail. I don't go looking for stories in buildings that are older than any job I've had. But this wasn't somebody's mail. This was an invitation. My hand went to the padlock as if it had made plans without me. It resisted this time in a way that felt petulant, then yielded. The hasp lifted. The hinge breathed. The door, of course, hadn't latched. It moved under my touch with the eager give of a loose tooth. Inside, the envelope with the letter L. It wasn't alone anymore. A second envelope sat beside it, edges kissing. The initial on this one was J, written in the same feathered ink. The dusting of glitter was thicker, clustered at one corner like a spill of sand on a map, marking a beach. When my torch beam crossed the interior metal, I saw fine scratches no wider than thread, circles, arcs, a pattern hacked into the paint with a stubborn, patient hand. The arcs overlapped until you couldn't make sense of them. It looked like someone had tried to teach geometry to a ghost. Control to East Wing, Lawson's voice said again, soft now, almost, but tired, pleased. Don't dawdle. I reached in and took both envelopes. They were damp without being wet. The powder clung. Something in my throat wanted to cough and wouldn't. I brought them close enough to smell. The scent of violets deepened, then broke with a strange tang, like the moment you bite a coin. Under the powder glimmer, I could see tiny, darker specks that didn't shine at all. For a second, I thought pepper. Then I looked closer, and they were letters too small to have been written, too orderly to be dust. The print from an old book braided down to pollen. I'm not a reader of signs, but I have a stomach for coincidence when it behaves. This felt like the sort that doesn't. I set the envelopes on top of the locker row and aimed the torch down the corridor. The length still felt wrong. The exit sign seemed to hang on an angle that made no sense, as if the ceiling had dropped a fraction at that end, and I'd never noticed. The light there flickered once, not the whole tube, just a single quiver that traveled along the red letters as though the word exit had caught a shiver and passed it on. From the far end, after the little flicker, came a sound that a reasonable man would call a broom being pulled across a stone. It scraped softly, paused, scraped again, like the punctuation. "Who's there?" I said, and heard myself be the kind of man who says that in stories where someone else laughs at his back. My voice didn't carry the way it should. It felt like the corridor had baffles, velvet line, soaking sound, The scrape came again, closer by a tile length. I scooped up the envelopes, pushed the locker door shut with my forearm, fed the hasp, swung the padlock, and found the gate wouldn't accept the tongue. The misalignment was small. I had to lift the door with my knee, hold the padlock high, and coax the shackle home. It clicked. The sound was too loud, too final. The scrape stopped. My torch beam caught a glimmer at ankle height, a tiny, newer glitter sliding like a spill. Then something, a draft is the word my mind insists, went by me towards the fire door, soft as a woman in a long dress exhaling. The powder at the base of the lockers ticked like frost does when a thaw begins. I backed into the stairwell and let the fire door catch me. Metal met metal with the hollow, stupid honesty of a thing doing its only job. Upstairs, the warmth of the main corridor felt like a hand on a forehead. The portraits of dead headmasters, bleared under varnish, all wattles and firm mouths, watched me with the blessing of men who never worked nights. I went to control as if returning to a seat after realizing UV stood up in a church at the wrong moment. The monitors glowed their soft, indifferent light. The kettle breathed like a tethered animal. On East Wing LWR, the corridor length looked normal. The numbers of paces in my head fought one another and canceled out. Locker 25 sat as it had always sat, a blister of rust, a padlock jaw neat and well-behaved. The powder glinted like a weak constellation. The time in the monitor corner rolled to 0313 and stayed there too long, then leapt to 0315 without admitting it had missed a step. I made a choice I tell myself I made for the sake of the job. I took the envelopes and placed them on the control desk, under the ledger, so their powder would not salt the floor. I put on gloves because once you start behaving as if something is evidence, you need to keep behaving as if it is. I slit the L envelope with the back of my thumbnail. It didn't open properly, not like new paper. It parted the way old cloth does where a seam's been unpicked and restitched twice. Inside there was a single sheet folded in 3. The crispness lost to damp, edges softened to the point you could run them at your lower lip and not feel the cut. The handwriting on the first line was firm in its bones and weak in its skin. Lucy, I have placed the spare in the second. If it disappears again, we shall have no more excuses. The second envelope, J, held a smaller square, once white, now cream, with that faint rot smell old textbooks have. No words, just an impression in the paper, a breast shaped like a key, S-teeth bitten through a napkin when someone is too clever and impatient to wait for ink. The powder glittered along the fold like sugar. There are 2 ways of reading a thing like that in the night. One is to decide you be stumbled on the school's private history and step back politely. Another is to understand that once addressed, the building expects an answer. I've always had the flaw of reply. I put the papers back, slid them into their soft graves, and sealed the envelopes as best I could. I wrote a note on plain paper for the morning. East Wing, Locker, 25, padlock misaligned. Contents may include old mail. Suggest bursarial check with estates. That's the bureaucratic way to say I want a second pair of eyes. The rest of the round should have been a relief. Chapel, locked, dining hall, stacked chairs like rows of kneeling boys. Music block, a single violin case left on a shelf with a cracked handle like an idea for a body. I checked the external doors and found the wind had got up, pressing itself against the old oak as if it remembered being inside. The radio was quiet. The clock above the desk put its hands out like a man surrendering. Time passed in clean inches, At 04:02, the East Wing monitor showed a change. Not the door this time. The camera itself was making choices. The auto iris yawned, drank too much light, snapped shut, then trembled open again. In the flare, I saw what the powder along the floor had drawn while I was away. It had been arranged, not quite letters, not quite script, lines curved and crossed, looping under and over themselves, the way you'd trace the path of a song if you could see it. In the center of the loops, tiny darker specks clustered like punctuation. I didn't go back down then. There's a point past which bravery looks like rudeness. I made a map instead from the monitor's view, penciling the loops the way I saw them while I drew. The kettle clicked off without having been turned on. While I drew, a moth butted the control room window and left a chalky half-moon on the glass. While I drew, the building shifted in a way no particular part did, like a sleeping person resettling a shoulder. At 04:30, Lawson arrived early with his leathery grin and a paper bag that breathed the smell of bacon rolls. He has the kind of face that looks as if it has slept under more roofs than a house. He looked at my drawing, didn't ask, didn't mock, and said, "You saw her then?" I let a laugh out, like a man who has decided this is the moment to be normal. "Saw who?" "The one who loves envelopes," he said, tearing his roll cleanly in half. One winter, 2018, I had the East Wing camera tell me a story for 3 nights. Paper on the floor like frost. Thought the IT lot would blame it on spiders. Their philosophy of life being, if a spider did it, it's not our job. I told the bursar. He told me to keep to main corridors. Then the powder stopped. Then someone put a key on the control room desk that fit nothing in my ring. That was the end of it. Until now, looks like. He said it like you might say the owls are back. "Powder," I said. He pinched the air, eyes unfocused the way people's get when they've watched a thing alone. "Glitter and dust. Smells like cakes in old rooms." "What did you do with the key?" "Gave it to estates. They gave it to housekeeping. They gave it to lost property. Lost property gave it to a drawer." He smiled. "We're all cogs, mate." The relief I felt, stupid, bodily, as soon as my strangeness had a precedent, surprised me. I wanted to show him the envelopes, to hand him the weight of them and say, "See?" But a small, selfish part of me didn't want to share how the paper had felt, how the powder had stuck, how the corridor had stretched like a yawn. It was mine. And that, I think, is part of how buildings like Hemsley keep you. They give you a private door and make you think you're the first to find it. The sky behind the control room window paled the way it does here in winter, as if someone is rubbing the color out with a sleeve. 6 o'clock birds decided it was time to practice. Pipes woke with that initial cough. The monitors looked less powerful in daylight, more like bad mirrors. I finished the log, signed my name, and left the note for the bursar about locker 25. I did not sleep well. The kind of tired that comes after nights like that doesn't want sleep. It wants a new body to be in. When the evening came, the school did what schools do, put on the face it keeps for parents and governors. The canteen shone. The brass plates at the house doors pretended never to tarnish. The matron in Greenwood House told me a boy had broken his wrist playing rugby and thanked me for last week as help with the ambulance, as if thanks could file the night smooth. I nodded and drank tea that tasted like cardboard. At 22:10, I checked East Wing LWR again, though I had no rounds to take me there. The camera showed nothing but the expected boredom of painted brick. The powder line was gone. The tiles looked their right length. I leaned back and pretended not to wait. At 𝗦𝗬𝗂𝗪, the monitor flickered. The flicker ran like a thought along the bottom, then up the right side, then through the word exit as if the sign had had an idea. The padlock on 25 jolted in place the way a sleeping person does when their dream drops them down a stair. At 𝗦𝗬𝗂𝗪, the line of light at the locker AS lip appeared as if someone inside had struck a match and held it almost shut. At 𝗦𝗬𝗀𝗏𝗏, the door sighed open a fraction and stopped. I went down with the torch, each stair a promise I felt I was breaking. The corridor was its old length. The air was colder. My breath felt like it was running ahead of me to see if there was anything to report. At 25, the padlock had not been threaded through the hasp, only hung the wrong way like a schoolboy's tie at the end of term. The powder scent was already in the air, though I couldn't see a grain of it. The door opened with less persuasion than before, as if remembering me. Inside, the envelopes had multiplied. 4 now, L, J, and 2 unmarked. One of the unmarked had a smear on the back as if someone, S, thumb, had dragged across still damp ink, leaving no letter, only the suggestion of one. The scratches on the metal interior were more definite, not geometry this time, but a map. A rough, stubborn map, carved by someone who couldn't draw, who had only the same circle to make. I knew the circle in the way you know the path you always walk. It was the east wing lower ground, its scale wrong, but its insistence right. In the center of the circle, a tiny cross had been hit over and over until the paint below was bare. Something whispered down the corridor then. I say whispered, because that is what the ear tells the mind when it can define a word. It was the kind of sound rooms make when they decide to stop being shy. I looked up, and the exit sign at the end of the corridor was an 𝗦𝗬𝗂𝗪 an exit sign. The letters were an arrangement of red that my head knew and my eyes refused, a pattern that reminded me of how a word looks when you stare too long and it becomes gibberish, then a stranger, then a made-up thing. The sign blinked, and I saw exit again, prim and decent. Beyond it, something shifted, just beyond where the light gave up. A pale sweep like paper turned in a long hand. I took the unmarked envelope, because that was the choice that didn't try to be brave. The flap had not been sealed. It lay meekly against itself as if waiting. Inside was no letter. There was a dusting of powder, finer than the rest, and in it, the impression of teeth, not human. Too even, too flat, like the bite of a key pressed sideways. When I tipped it into my palm, I expected the glimmer to slide. It held as if thinking. East Wing, Lawson's voice said in my radio, and though I knew he was at home in his bed, I answered because the corridor had changed the rules. Here, I said. Try the second, he said, and something in his voice sounded like a memory, not his own. The locker's numbers ran 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. The second of what? The second envelope. The second locker. The second, the scratches inside the door circled the corridor with cheap accuracy and marked the center. In my hand, the powder on the paper arranged itself when I moved, the way iron filings find a magnet's thought. The impression of teeth pointed me left, then left again, then down, then nowhere. The radio popped and was silent. I chose the second locker from the right of 25, number 27, and tugged. It didn't move. The padlock was eaten with rust. I put the envelope up to it, like a fool reading a charm. The powder ran in a tiny flow along the envelope, as grease, and hung from the paper like a bead of water that refuses to drop. It slid itself into the keyhole mouth and stayed. No crumble, no fall. as if the hole were a throat and the powder a thing needing. The padlock ticked, a small, brave sound. The shackles sprang. I opened locker 27. There was, impossibly, a key inside. Not a modern Yale, not one of our bump-resistant school keys, but a long shank with teeth like a tidy skyline, the sort you see on props in plays, theatrical, and a little vain. It was wrapped in a sliver of fabric, once white, now funeral shroud gray. The powder had pressed itself into the weave. When I lifted the key, the corridor breathed in. I felt it in the fine hairs at my wrist. A shadow moved under the exit sign. Not a person's shadow, a door's, as if something tall and rectangular had been drawn in light at the end of the passage, and then opened, admitting a darker dark. In the corner of my eye, the tile pattern repeated wrong again, and then corrected itself like a child caught cheating. I took the key and the envelopes and backed away. I didn't shut locker 27. The idea of trying the padlock again made my mouth taste like old coins. I reached the fire door and put my shoulder to it, with a respect that would look like fear to anyone watching. Upstairs, the lights felt like two hands, one on either shoulder, pushing gently toward ascents. I told myself not to run. I told myself to breathe. I told myself that if a building wants to show you something, it will. And the worst thing you can do is pretend you didn't see. Back in control, the monitors showed what they always show. The story cut for television, the fear edited out. East Wing 𝗪𝗚𝗓 was polite again. The exit sign corrected. The locker row was nap still. In my palm, the key was heavier than its size deserved. I set it on the desk beside the ledger, and it made a sound like cutlery in a quiet house. I didn't drink the tea I made. I watched the minute hand become a quarter hour, then another. I listened to the building get ready for the day by warming its bones. At 05:30, the kitchen lights came on, and the first smell of bread rolled under the door like a mercy. I put the envelopes in an evidence sleeve from a kit we keep for break-ins. I put the key in another. I wrote, found in East Wing 𝗪𝗚𝗓, locker 27, 02.23/02/30, retrieved by night security. I signed it with a hand that shook less than it should. When the bursar arrived, he listened without interrupting, which is a skill of his and a form of power. He is a thin man built of angle and assurance, who believes that buildings and boys do as they're told, if told correctly. When I finished, he said, "We'll have estates sweep the area. Do not please indulge the cameras. The governors are visiting Sunday." That was all. Do not indulge the cameras, as though I'd been feeding them sweets. After he left, I looked at East Wing 𝗪𝗚𝗓 one more time. In the dull daylight, the powder along the floor made a last faint show, a sketch of loops, like the signature of someone who never quite learned their name. A draft from somewhere stirred it, and it lifted and faded, leaving the tiles honest again. I slept then, clumsy as a man laid down by water. When I woke, afternoon light laid bars across my flat, like a promise I hadn't made. The key sat on my kitchen table where I'd laid it, without remembering. I don't bring work home, not ever. I must have done it by habit, an instinct older than rules. If something doesn't belong to a room, take it where it can't pretend. The third night I decided not to wait. I walked to East Wing before the monitors could start their polite lies, and stood in the corridor with the key in my pocket, the powder scent already ahead of me, like the ghost of a bakery inside a museum. The lockers lined both sides in their ruined teeth. The exit sign bled and bled its tiny red. I counted the tiles under my shoes. The number was right. The length was wrong. The corridor had learned me. Now, I would learn it back. The first 5 minutes of any night hold the shape of what follows. The corridor knew that better than I did. I slid the key along the row like a diviner with a twig, too embarrassed to say so even to myself. At 25, the key did not warm. At 26, it did. At 27, it hummed in my fingers in a way that wasn't sound. At 28, something behind the exit sign breathed. And somewhere, out of my sight but inside the building's knowledge of me, another door chose to open. The first thing you learn on a tower is how many kinds of quiet there are. There's the noon quiet that hums like a transformer, resin sweating out of the pines, flies stitching lazy figure eights. There's the 2 a.m. quiet that sounds like glass, every creak a crack, every wind shift a fingertip on the pane. And there's the quiet right before lightning, when the air smells like coins, and the hair on your forearms decides it wants to be a barometer. I signed on to watch Tower 7 for a second season, because I liked that quiet. Northern California, east of the river, a notch of ridge where Douglas fir gives up to manzanita. The cab is a 12x12 glass dice on stilts. The Osborne firefinder sits fat and patient in the center, its brass ring shining like it doesn't hold other people's decisions. You learn your bearings, your landmarks, the honest names and the ones the locals use. Badger Ridge, Sheep Springs, Huckle Grade. You learn to talk on the radio like it's not a person listening, but a machine that files what you say into consequence. Dispatch raised red flag warnings by lunchtime the day it started. RAW stations reported single-digit humidity. Forecast models, HRR, NAM, showed a dry line punching in from the southeast. Expect scattered dry lightning late, Control said. Keep lines open. By late afternoon, I could hear the valley readying itself. The highway down below became a string of chrome. The volunteer station a mile west kept its bay doors open. In the cab, I worked my checklist like a ritual. Refill the butter bucket with water. Unclip the handline. Check the binoculars for grit. The tower logs, heavy green ledger books with cottony paper, sat open to a page where someone from the 1980s had doodled a little moose in the margin. The moose, I decided, was a good omen. At 21:07, the first anvil walked over the hills. The sky turned bruise-colored. Wind came up the tower stairs and put a thumb under the door. I unplugged the cabin S phone line, old habit when metal S involved, and clipped the handheld on my belt. Static hissed on command like a stove starter. Watch Tower 7, Control, dispatch said. Lightning advisory in effect. Maintain lookout as safe. 7 copies. The first strike hit somewhere southeast, the bright white of magnesium. On the Osborne, I laid a pencil along the azimuth, followed it across the paper map to a place where contour lines tightened like ribs. I wrote 136 to 15 miles, give or take. Nothing rose. Sometimes it takes hours for a smoke to show. Sometimes the strike hits rock and the only thing that burns is your nerves. I was reaching for the thermos when a voice came over a channel I wasn't on. Column 040, Mossback, 2 minutes. Not dispatch, not any of our divisions, not air attack. The voice was clean and ordinary, neither male nor female until you decided it was one. No call sign, no break, just the words, followed by a hush the way a hammer leaves a ring. I looked at my radio like it had betrayed me. The incident net, that's command, was on 171.575. Air guard idle. TAC was quiet. The scanner sat on top of the first aid box, cycling through weather, Hamnets, the county sheriff. The voice hadn't come from there. It had arrived like a thought you'd been about to have anyway. 040 is northeast. Mossback is a little ridge, the name locals use for the line of basalt knobs east of a ranch somebody turned into a wedding venue. I swung the Osborne to 040. Nothing. Sky, hill, sky. 7 to control, I said, more formal than I meant to be. Possible column developing near Mossback Ridge, bearing 040. No visible smoke yet. Monitoring. A beat. Copy, 7. Dispatch said, we've got engines staged. Advise when you have eyes. 2 minutes is a long time when you're deciding what you're allowed to believe. At 1 minute and 50 seconds, my wristwatch told me that with the bossiness of quartz, the far thin line between ridge and sky smudged, took another breath to become a smear. By the next 3, the smear decided it wanted to be smoke. Pale, ironed flat by the dry air, it leaned the way a person leans when someone whispers their name. 7 to control. Confirmed smoke, Mossback 040, approximate 15 miles. Light, white-gray, no flame visible. Copy 7, dispatch said. Engines 12, 14, Squad 2, response. Division Alpha, be advised. 7, continue to watch. I marked the ledger with the time and drew a thin fingertip-wide line on the map where the bearing crossed the road network. In the corner of the page I wrote, without knowing why I wanted to write it, 2 minutes. The engines went. Radio traffic picked up and became the language you only learn on a season. Copy, your traffic. Go ahead, repeat. Line me up off that ridge. Someone's voice, Div A, asked if air attack was available, and dispatch said negative. The ship on a medevac. Engines reported dust and washboards. The smoke thickened and moved into that ugly yellow-brown that means brush and oak duff. I watched and I listened, and every time lightning knocked the sky awake, I could feel the cab, the whole cab, lift and settle like a person in a dream. At 23:22, the voice came back. South spur of Badger. 1. Badger is due east of us. The south spur is a slide scar where the road switchbacks and the manzanita grows on its elbows. 1 minute. 1 mile. 1 what? 7 to control, I said. Possible ignition, South Spur, Badger Ridge, bearing 090, range approximately 9. No visible smoke. Monitoring. Copy 7, dispatch said, and I could hear the polite restraint. Dispatchers learn not to say what they're thinking. Will advise Div A. The voice had said 1. I gave it 1 minute and couldn't help myself. Counted under my breath like a kid, timing how long the rain takes to reach the roof after you see it in the trees. At 56, 57, 58, there it was, a sliver of dirty cotton unrolling itself behind the spur. Mean little thing that wanted to be bigger. When you're right twice in a row, you either relax or you don't. I didn't. The easy story that I about heard thunder and guessed is something you tell yourself so the world remains the size you like it. But the voice was using my landmarks, naming the places the way the old maps did. Badger's Spur, not the county's newer name. And it was ahead. By minutes. That's what hooked under the ribs and tugged. Who's on that channel? I asked the room. Because talking to rooms is something the job teaches you too. The scanner muttered weather language. The handheld sat innocently at my elbow and offered nothing. Outside, the ridge threw a long seam of black under the belly of the clouds, and the air stank like cut sage. The night came in pieces. Engines put wet line around Mossback before midnight. A good thing the size of a kitchen. The badger's spur sputtered, hooked a stump, tried to run, got slapped. The lightning kept marching northwest and missing my little square, like it was doing me a favor it didn't need one credit for. When I stood too quickly, the tower felt taller than it had in the afternoon. At 𝗦𝗧𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗏, I wrote in the ledger the way you write, just to make your hand obey. A line that said, Radio anomaly. Check scanner tomorrow. Rowan draw. Left bank. 3. Rowan is not a name on the county map. Rowan is a name I only knew because of the kind of story old-timers tell at supply pickups. The logging company used to have a spur road and a little winter camp down in a draw where the creek turned lazy. The map calls it Blue Mill Creek now, and the draw, if you look at the contour lines, is one of those mean little hooks that points at itself. Left bank, if you're walking upstream, is the side where a catbrier thicket tried to eat my pants last season. 7 to control, I said. Possible ignition, Blue Mill Creek drainage, left bank. No smoke visible. Will advise. I swung the Osborne. The creek lay in the kind of gloom that would hide a whale if whales did brush. The only light was the occasional wash of heat, lightning turning the pines silver. I looked until my eyes invented things and had to look away. I counted slower because the voice had said 3, and so why not be literal? At 2 minutes and 20 seconds, I told myself I was ridiculous. At 2:30, I decided I was hearing the transformer hum up from the valley. At 2:45, something lifted from the draw and died. At 2:59, it lifted again and tried to be real. At 3, the smoke went from pretend to true. I told dispatch. They copied. Wind nudged the tower like a friend who wanted to tell me a joke. After the Rowan call, quiet had a new shape. It wasn't glass anymore. It was listening. I could hear my own pulse in the headphones, and inside it faint the idea that I was on 2 nets at once. The official one with its call signs and colors, and another that belonged to the ridge itself. In the ledger, I wrote the times and the bearings, and next to them the number the voice had said, 2, 1, 3. My handwriting got small. I could smell ozone and wet granite and, weirdly, something sweet, like the first drink from a can of root beer. At 𝗓𝗓08, lightning pulled its old trick of hitting where nobody wants it, right across the river, up behind a place people go to fish when they don't want to see their neighbors. The radio filled with everything at once. A volunteer engine lost its map. Someone's dog. Don't ask me why there was a dog on command. There's always a dog. Barked directly into a microphone. 𝗏𝗏𝗡𝗏's voice settled over it, calm in the way a quiet room can be a kind of command. 7. Can you line me up a bearing on that last strike? I lined him up. He copied. The voice, the other one, the one without a sign, stayed silent. It stayed silent long enough that I wondered if I had invented it as a trick to keep myself from thinking about the tower as 4 lightning legs. Then, when the night had gone thin enough, you could pretend it was morning if you stared at your watch long enough. It came back. Old name for it is Huckle Grade, it said, before the county changed the sign. 2 minutes. The county changed the sign in 2004 after an argument that took up 3 town hall meetings and a letter to the editor that used the word heritage too much. Huckle Grade ran from the saddle to the bald ridge, and the old folks used it to move sheep. The new sign calls it County Road 49B, and the line on the paper map is neat and boring. Nobody on the radio, nobody on any of the nets I'd ever listened to, used 𝗏𝗏 like that. My throat felt tight, as if the cabin air had done something petty to me without meaning to. 7 to control, I said. Possible smoke, 𝗏𝗏 area. No visual. Copy 7, dispatch said. We'll monitor. 2 minutes. The ridge tried to be a different ridge and then, embarrassed, was itself again. In the old ledger from the 90s, there's a leaf pressed flat into September 2nd, a little maple that had lost the idea of red and become a square of fragile leather. Next to it, in someone's pencil that had time to sharpen itself, a note, local call sign Blue Jay, says watch the run on Huckle. The first whisper of smoke on 𝗏𝗏 might have been a trick of dawn. It had the color of nothing, and then, with a little indecency, I recognized from seeing brush decide to run. A lace of brown at the edge. My mouth said, 7 to control, confirming smoke 𝗏𝗏. At the exact moment my head said, you can't possibly be seeing that yet. Copy, dispatch said. Engines will divert. Div-A, advise. Div-A copies, the calm voice replied. 7, any wind on your tower? I looked at the little ribbon outside the window. Red cloth tattered from last season. Permanent windsock. East at 6, enough to push. Enough to make 𝗏𝗏 think it could be clever. East 6 to 8, I said. Gusting 10. The mountains give you out and back time. Engines fought the 𝗏𝗏 fire home, line held by first honest light. Smoke lay like old breath in the low places. The thunderheads had stumbled away into Oregon to make new promises there. I wrote my final entries and signed them, and when I set the pencil down, my hand kept the shape of it, like a tool had grown a grip in my bones. The tower stairs pinged as the metal cooled. The valley below remembered that it liked being a place where people went to work and did not spend all their time watching the sky. The scanner on the first aid box gave me the sheriff, S. morning humor, and the weather lady, S. gentleness. I reached to switch it off and found my fingers hovering over a button I never used. Local VHF 3, a burp of frequency someone had labeled with a strip of tape, and the neat, dancing letters of a person who prints like a second-grade teacher. I pressed it. The speaker gave me the hiss of distance, and then, under it, a single syllable. A name, I thought at first. Then I realized it was 2 letters. A call sign's start. KD, it said. And then the machine, or the ridge, or the part of my brain that had learned a new quiet, cut it away. We had a lull that lasted a day and a half. Crews slept in the grass and then stood when their pagers told them to. The bakery in town ran out of apple fritters by 10, which is how you know folks drove in to say thank you. I stayed in my dice and learned the hot names of a dozen small flies. Watched a hawk make the kind of lazy circles you make when you want something to see you looking. At midnight the second day, I took the ledger from the drawer where the moose lived and flip-paged backward. August 1987. 4 little columns of neat notes documenting old burns and the first days of a new lookout who wrote. In round, drawing letters. June 1995. A coffee ring. August 2018. A note about a repeater out on hardscrabble, and below it, a penciled call sign. KD6VLM, Alma. Alma wasn't a ridge or a road. It was a person. KD6 is a ham prefix. VLM is just VLM until it isn't. Someone had written the name like you write a reminder your hand doesn't want to forget. That night the storms came back and brought a meaner wind. The first strike beat the 2-minute warning by 20 seconds, which made me petty. When I said column at 085 into command, my voice had victory in it. 20 seconds isn't a life. but sometimes it's enough to be proud at. The voice from the other net, if that's what it was, didn't answer me. It called its bearings the way you call a dog you don't expect to come. 2 minutes. 1, 2. Then, twice in a row, it used names nobody's had any reason to use unless they had been sitting where I was sitting 15 or 20 years ago, listening to a different sky. Milk House Hollow, Fox's Cut. I called them to dispatch without the old names and watched the smoke appear at the polite coordinate equivalents. Engines rode like lines on a topographic map. I was sweating and cold, and the tower smelled like penny lightning, and old wood warmed too fast. At 0243, the voice did something it hadn't done. It whispered, not quieter. There is no quiet on a radio, not like that. But something about the shape of the sentence made it land softer, as if the net itself had told it to be careful. Don't let the east wind take the hucklehead, it said. Watch your ground. That last, the ordinary courtesy of it, undid me a little. I'd been treating the voice as a tool I could lay on the map. It reminded me I had feet on boards, a chest that lifted and fell, hands that wanted badly not to shake. 7 to control, I said to the right net. Wind now east 12, watching hucklehead. Copy, 7, dispatch said. And the pause after copy was one of those pauses that, once you've done a season, you hear for what it is. Somebody counting to 3, so they don't say what they want to say. At 03 and 05, Huckle tried to put a hand over the line. I could see the heat in the half-light, a sort of dampness where nothing wet exists. Div A asked if engines could shift. Engine said negative. Crew 2 said they'd hump tool around the slop. The east wind, woken fully now, pushed its palm into the small of Huckle ES back and told it a story about a town 5 miles downslope with a grocery. I looked at the map and drew a line with my finger where I thought Huckle would go if it got what it wanted. The line landed on a drainage that ran straight like a lie. The voice came like a hand over mine, laying its finger on the same drainage. It didn't name it. It didn't need to. I called it. 7 to control. Recommend engine stage at 49B and the old sheep gate. If Huckle runs, it'll run the drainage. Copy, 7, dispatch said. Div A, advise. Div A advised. Engines, to their credit, and possibly because they were the kind of people who know that a tower is a place you can trust on a night like that, staged. The run started lazy and then tried to sprint. It punched into the drainage and met a dozer line installed in a year that had one of those names, fire years. Get when they want you to be polite later. When it hit where men and women with tools and water and habits were waiting. The edge knocked its teeth and forgot what it was about to say. First light brought the ship, and the ship wrote blue-white water into the air like a cure. And by noon, Huckle had the kind of black fingertip people pat when they're happy. The town downslope woke and made coffee, and didn't he know its alarm had been the size of a ridge? I sat on the edge of the tower landing and watched the steam and listened to the stairs ping, and for the first time in 2 nights, didn't feel like the air might suddenly take an interest in me. I slept on the floor of the cab with the radio volume turned to a mercy and dreamed that the Osborne turned under my hand on its own and drew circles until the pencil wore down to brass. In the dream, the circles overlapped and made a pattern like a net, or the map behind the map. When I woke, I thought I might have been crying, which is the kind of thing you don't admit unless you alone or writing a report nobody else will ever read. The voice spoke once more. It was full daylight. The ship was being sent to a new start on the other side of the river. I was standing with my knuckles against the cool window glass, looking at a hawk. The radio clicked, and the channel I had not chosen made a single little sound, like a throat clearing, and then the voice said, "Good work, Seven." Maybe it meant me personally. Maybe it meant the tower and the ridge and the way a map can hold a person's hand if they put their finger down hard enough. Then, as if it remembered it had manners, it said, "From Alma," and the carrier died. KD6VLM. Alma, a woman who sat in this box and written the old names in pencil so they wouldn't to take up much space, because you never know who has to use the map next. I did the thing a rational person does. I checked the scanner. I checked the handheld. I checked the logbook and found the number of the ham repeater on hardscrabble. It was indeed off the air. That was the rational part. The other part was the way the tower smelled for half a second, like a sweater somebody you love has just taken off. At the end of the week, 𝗩𝗏𝗱𝗏𝗡𝗥 brought a sack of cinnamon rolls up the stairs for the glass house, which did us a solid. He stood in the cab with the carefulness of a man who knows not to bump into things you don't or to replace, and looked around at the old photographs tacked to the corkboard. "You know Alma?" he asked, touching his cap brim the way some men do when they use a woman's name and want the air to know they mean respect. "Only the call sign," I said, "and her handwriting. She draw a moose." He laughed, the kind that runs out of a person soft, like they were saving it for later, and then discovered it was theirs to spend. She drew moose, and she made us pull a line on Huckle in 1998, when nobody thought it would try to run that way. City Council gave her a plaque and spelled her last name wrong. She took a picture with the plaque and pinned the receipt to the logbook, so nobody would forget the salesman tried to upsell her a frame. Where is she now? He didn't look at me when he said, "Gone last winter," which tells you everything you need to know. Kid in her ham club brought a casserole to the memorial and didn't know where to set it down. I poured us coffee from the thermos, and we didn't talk about voices or old names, because there is a kind of gift you don't make smaller by holding it up to the light and insisting everyone tell you they see what you see. He ate half a cinnamon roll like he hadn't eaten anything since Tuesday. When he left, he took the trash bag down with him without being asked. I wrote his name in the ledger and the time, and in the margin where the moose lived, a little sheep gate. The summer rolled forward the way summers do when the grass has decided its paper, and then fall arrived in a morning with a sky so blue it looked invented. We had fire, but not the kind that makes television. We had holds and slops, and those nasty little stump holes that look like a prank until they eat your boot. Every so often, I'd press the local VHF button and listen to nothing, and, because I'm honest, hope. When I was tired enough, I think I heard a syllable. When I was honest enough, I wrote "no traffic" and underlined it. On my last day on the tower, the valley painted itself with that dusty gold you only get when the chaparral gives up for the year. I turned the Osborne south and then north, and thought about the way a person becomes a dial. I closed the ledger over the moose and the sheep gate, and the lines that belonged to the summer of the Huckle run. I unplugged the scanner and laid the power cord in a neat coil, with the arrogance of a person who believes he knows how to leave things tidy. I put my hand on the door and felt the little slap of cold that means the season is over. On the landing, I stopped and looked east. Huckle Grades sat there smug as a dog who'd have been told not to steal the pie, and then afterward been forgiven. The wind came up the stairs and put its thumb in my shirt, on a frequency I didn't have a button for, the kind that lays into the bones of stairs and at the frames of windows and the brass ring of a firefinder. I heard the tail end of a sentence I could have imagined if I wanted to, and didn't have to. If I dignity, watch your ground. I locked the cab and set the key in the little metal box the way we all do when we leave a place and hope it as a promise. Down below, a pickup's door slammed. The bakery had apple fritters again. On the way to town, I drove past the sheep gate and the old sign that says "Huckle in a hand," that loses its paint and refuses to admit it. I didn't say the names out loud, because there are names you don't say, unless the ridge asks for them. I turned on the radio and heard the pleasant nonsense of music and traffic, and somebody arguing about the game. When I drove into cell service, my phone woke up and told me the incident report had been posted. The one I knew would be printed on bland paper and filed under a number and a name. It was the normal report you'd expect. Ignition times, weather, resources, outcomes. At the bottom, where the little boxes live for notes, there was one line nobody had any reason to type me, unless they sat where I sat and looked at the ridge and understood that not everything you trust comes with a call sign. Credit, early lookout detection, it said. Assistance, local knowledge.